David, thank you so much for being here. Really great read. We're showing the headline of your story right now. Maybe you can just start off by telling us a little bit about this company, Zola, what their promise was going into it, and how they were sort of helping the transition to clean energy in some of these nations.
Yeah, Pago Solar was one of the great hopes to get the developing world on board in meeting some of the carbon goals for the world and to get clean energy. The thought was that since many of these poor communities in Africa and Asia had, there were as much as 1 billion people a decade ago who didn't have electricity and there was no grid. Rather than building a grid, you could have solar energy, that would be in their homes, in their communities, and that would allow them, to avoid the carbon-based, electricity, and also save the cost of building an infrastructure. So one of the companies that came aboard was, it started as off-grid electric. It started with a lot of very idealistic people who had worked in the development world, and they were going to have solar panels on people's homes. They would own them and have people pay them off on a month. They would give them electricity, and then they'd pay it off over time. That evolved though because the cost of servicing the solar panels and keeping them running was so expensive. The industry moved to a pay-as-you-go model where they would be bought on credit by the homeowner, and that turned out to be a model that a lot like rent-to-own furniture in the U.S., where if you're not careful, it can become exploitive, and in many cases, we found that's what happened.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, David, and sort of how Zola fits into it? Because you really get into the story of Zola and sort of how they were trying to do what it is that you said, but that turned over time.
Yeah, Zola. So it started like a cell phone people buy, where you buy the minutes in advance, and then it switched to like a rent-to-own furniture model. And when that happened, because there's a lot of financing costs involved, it brought in all the kind of problems that consumer finance often runs into, with people at the lower end of the economic scale. And in Africa, because they were in Tanzania and in other parts of Africa that are very impoverished, you have people at the bottom of the economic pyramid. So, at first they owned all these assets. It was too expensive. They started selling it. And what happens is you get salespeople who are selling credit products to people who have no experience with credit, no experience with interest rates, no experience with banks in some cases, and so they sign on. Some of them don't understand. Sometimes you get salespeople we found who were being misleading people, and then you would get communities in Africa where sometimes 20, 30, 40% of people couldn't make their payments. When they didn't make their payments, they either had the systems repossessed on them, or in some cases, they would put them on a longer payment plan, and then they'd end up paying more interest and pay 10 times the original cost of a system over the course of it. That switched when off-grid electric became Zola, which was, it coincided with when the company got a major investment from Solar City. And Solar City, according to one of the founders who we quote in the story, Erica Mackey, when Solar City came in, they were telling them just expand at all, any way you have to do it, go expand. And then when Solar City ran into some of its financial problems around 2015, 2016, they started getting pressure that, look, we need to start thinking more about unit economics. And that filtered down to people on the ground, and there was more pressure to sell to people who couldn't really afford it.
So then if this has happened and this is, if some of these companies have realized that this is an issue, but at the same time, we were just talking about the IPCC report, which says that a lot of these nations need to make this transition. I mean, what's being done to address this tension here between profit and addressing climate change?
That's the problem, is that Pago Solar was a very seductive idea because it passed most of the costs on from the governments to the consumers, right? So the government would have to spend millions of dollars to build, a grid out to, a very expansive, difficult, expensive countries where it is to build this. So, this is something they really liked. And we've seen is that the development world started it and really put a lot of money into it. They continue to put money into it despite a lot of concerns that it's not working. And what made it worse was the startup world, because you get these companies on something that's called a social social enterprise credit trap, where you have a social organization that starts as a quasi charity. It wants to get bigger, so it needs private capital, but it goes to the startup world. And once you start getting money from hedge funds and from some private banks, there's interest rates that demand certain returns. And the economics of dealing with people at the bottom of the pyramid means you're only going to get those kind of returns in many cases if you use very aggressive sales tactics, very aggressive collection tactics. And so there are other alternatives, things like mini grids, where there would be a grid in a community that people can all walk to and use. And since that doesn't depend upon credit, for consumer credit, it can work more. It's less, it is less convenient for the consumer because it's not in their homes. But that's one thing that they're looking at. And there's been talk of, the pay-go industry is asking for more subsidies from governments, and it's not clear that that is really going to solve the problem.